Echoes of Witheridge. Written and narrated by the Neon Stories Project. In the sleepy town of Witheridge, something sinister was stirring. It wasn't the typical grievances of a small town. The mayoral scandal. The mayoral scandal, the annual county fair debacle, or the high school football team's losing streak. No, this was something far more malevolent. A creeping darkness that echoed through the deserted streets and empty houses. Elijah Hawthorne had returned to Witheridge after 20 years of living in the city. He had left behind the noise, pollution, and soul-crushing grind of the metropolis to care for his ailing mother. His arrival coincided with the first unusual occurrence, an incident that sent ripples of fear and confusion through the close-knit community. Beneath the crimson gaze of the setting sun, Elijah pulled into the gravel driveway of his childhood home. A pang of nostalgia hit him, but it was quickly replaced with a sense of unease. The house, once a picture of suburban charm, now stood withered and weathered by time, much like his mother. Later that night, he woke to the shrill ringing of the telephone. Groaning, he glanced at the digital clock on his bedside table. 3 o'clock in the morning. Who on earth would be calling at this hour? His heart pounded with a sudden dread as he thought of his mother in the next room. Had something happened to her? He rushed to answer. Hello. His voice sounded groggy, still half asleep. Elijah, a voice hissed. It was Mrs. Campbell, their next-door neighbor, her voice filled with unmistakable terror. Something's in my house. Elijah was awake now. I can hear it, scratching, growling. Suddenly, the line went dead. Dread seized Elijah's gut. His mind spun, tangled in a web of confusion and fear, but he had no time to sort through it. He rushed into the cold night, the wind nipping at his face, clutching a baseball bat. His heart pounded like a jackhammer as he neared Mrs. Campbell's house, a quaint Victorian relic that had always fascinated him as a child. The house was dark, save for a flickering light from the upstairs bedroom. He knocked on the door. The sound echoed ominously in the still night. No response. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door. It creaked, the sound slicing through the silence like a knife. Mrs. Campbell? He called out, his voice trembling. No answer. Only silence met his call, a silence so profound it was deafening. A sudden sound shattered the silence, a low, guttural growl reverberating from the walls. It echoed around him, a dark symphony that twisted his insides. He swallowed, his dry mouth tasting of fear. He had to find Mrs. Campbell. He ventured further into the house, every creak of the wooden floor beneath his feet, amplified in the dreadful silence. He moved towards the staircase, the growling noise becoming louder with each step. It seemed to pulsate within the walls, vibrating with a life of its own. Elijah reached the top of the stairs. Mrs. Campbell's bedroom door stood ajar, the flickering light casting grotesque shadows on the hallway carpet. He pushed the door open, his heart hammering in his chest. There she was, huddled in the corner of her room, her eyes wide with terror. But it wasn't her that held his gaze. It was the walls. They seemed to breathe, pulsating with an eerie rhythm that matched the chilling growl. It was as if the house itself had come alive. And then, in the dim light, he saw it. Elijah froze, his mind unable to comprehend the sight. But he knew one thing. They had to get out of there. With a cry, Elijah ran to Mrs. Campbell, pulling her to her feet. Her body was stiff with terror, her eyes still fixed on the undulating walls. We need to leave, now, he shouted over the unsettling din. He half led, half dragged her down the stairs and out of the cursed house. As they stumbled onto the gravel pathway, a deafening crash echoed behind them. They turned to see the Victorian house shudder violently, its framework groaning under an unseen strain. Elijah didn't dare to look back again. He sprinted with Mrs. Campbell back to his house, the blood pounding in his ears. Once inside, he bolted the door and called the sheriff's office. His account was met with incredulity, but the urgency in his voice was enough to send a patrol car their way. When Sheriff Hensley arrived, the Campbell house was quiet. Its sinister show ended as suddenly as it had started. The elder lawman listened to their recount of the incident with a grave face. "You both need some rest," he said finally, promising to keep an eye on things. Elijah wasn't sure if the sheriff believed them, or if he was simply appeasing two panicked citizens. In the following days, Witheridge was gripped by a palpable sense of dread. Other incidents were reported, all eerily similar to what had occurred at the Campbell house. It seemed the town had become host to an unseen force, one that struck indiscriminately, sowing fear in the hearts of the townsfolk. Whispers turned into theories, theories into town lore. People speculated about a vengeful spirit, a curse, even the handiwork of extraterrestrial beings. But all the theories fell short, unable to explain the terror that had wrapped its icy fingers around Witheridge. But as fear overtook the town, Elijah began to suspect something far worse. The sinister force didn't seem to be just a random occurrence. It seemed to be personal, vengeful. It felt as if the darkness wasn't invading Witheridge, but rather it was coming from it, or more accurately, from its own past. Elijah began delving into the town's history, spending his days in the dusty archives of the local library. His mother, now recovering, offered snippets of town folklore, of a time before Elijah was born when strange events plagued Witheridge. She spoke of a darkness that had once threatened to engulf the town, an echo of the present dread. One name, in particular, stood out: Silas Bain. A prominent figure in Witheridge's history, Bain was a prosperous businessman and a man of significant influence. But his reputation was tainted with rumors of occult practices and macabre rites. The townsfolk accused him of conjuring an unspeakable evil, causing a series of unfortunate events before he mysteriously disappeared. Was the town now paying for his transgressions? Driven by a growing suspicion, Elijah visited the dilapidated Bain Manor at the outskirts of town. The mansion was an imposing monument of the past, forgotten by time, its grandeur swallowed by decades of neglect. He made his way into the bowels of the mansion, down into the basement that was rumored to be Bain's den of occult activities. The air was heavy with the scent of dampness and decay. He swept his flashlight around, revealing the cracked walls covered in strange symbols and inscriptions. Then his light fell upon something strange. A mural, large and intricate, decorated one wall. It depicted Witheridge, with the houses represented as small blobs of color. And from each house, a dark line extended towards a central figure, a figure eerily resembling Silas Bain, arms outstretched as if receiving the darkness. Elijah felt a chill run down his spine. The mural seemed to resonate with the present events. An ominous prophecy etched in the stone. The sinister force terrorizing Witheridge was directly linked to Silas Bain. The darkness extracted from the houses a tribute to his twisted rites. A revelation dawned on him. The darkness was not invading the town. Armed with this unsettling revelation, Elijah went back to town, desperate to share his findings. He showed pictures of the mural to Sheriff Hensley, who listened with a skeptical frown. "Old Silas Bain, huh?" he mused. "My grandma used to tell me tales about him. Scary stuff for a kid. But it's just town legend, Elijah." Elijah tried to argue, to convince Hensley of the dire threat they were facing. But it was futile. The pragmatic sheriff refused to believe the town's current predicament was anything more than a series of unexplained phenomena. Frustrated but undeterred, Elijah decided to take matters into his own hands. He returned to the Bain Manor, venturing deeper into the heart of the decaying structure. he found himself drawn to the mural again, his gaze drawn to the figure of Bane. A thought struck him. Perhaps the solution was not just to stop the summoning, but to reverse it. If he could decipher the symbols and rituals on the mural, maybe he could turn the darkness against itself, force it back from whence it came. For days, Elijah toiled, studying the mural, translating the symbols, recreating the rites. He felt a strange power emanating from the ritual, an ancient force that thrummed through the air. At times, he could almost see it, a darkness writhing just beyond the edge of his perception. Finally, one stormy night, he was ready. Standing before the mural, he began to enact the ritual. He chanted the incantations, moved through the motions, mirroring the figure of Bane. As he did, an eerie silence fell over the town. The growling in the walls ceased, replaced by a high-pitched whine that echoed through the empty streets. Elijah continued the ritual, his voice echoing in the ancient basement. Suddenly, a violent gust of wind swept through the manor, extinguishing the candles and plunging the room into darkness. But in the darkness, something stirred. A low growl, not coming from the walls this time, but from the mural itself. Elijah continued the ritual, his voice unwavering in the face of the mounting dread. And then, just as the fear threatened to consume him, a brilliant light burst forth from the mural. It radiated throughout the basement, chasing away the shadows. The light continued to pulsate, bathing the entire town of Witheridge in its ethereal glow. The growling noise ceased abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. Back in the heart of the Bane Manor, Elijah squinted through the blinding light. His heart pounded like a drum as the light began to concentrate into a single spot on the mural, where the figure of Bane had been. Slowly, the figure began to take form again, but it was no longer an inanimate image. It moved, the silhouette of a man writhing in agony, as if trapped in the wall. Elijah watched in stunned silence as the figure of Bane contorted, the darkness within him struggling against the brilliant light. The walls of the manor shook as if in the throes of a massive earthquake. And then, with a final, gut-wrenching scream, the figure disintegrated, leaving the wall blank. A sudden calmness descended, an eeriness that contrasted starkly with the moments of chaos that had just passed. The ethereal light gradually receded, leaving behind the dimly lit basement. In the silence that followed, Elijah stumbled out of the Bane Manor, a mixture of relief and disbelief washing over him. The town of Witheridge was still, the eerie silence a far cry from the unsettling events of the past few weeks. The following morning, the people of Witheridge woke up to a changed town. The sinister presence was gone, replaced by a tranquility that had been absent for so long. There were no more growling noises, no more fears of an unseen entity. News of Elijah's solitary battle spread through the town, earning him both praise and disbelief. The sheriff, although still skeptical, couldn't argue with the newfound peace. Life slowly returned to normal in Witheridge, but for Elijah, the experience had left a deep impact. He had faced a darkness beyond comprehension and emerged victorious. But even as he relished the calm, he couldn't help but remember the mural. Bane was gone, but the symbols and rituals remained etched in the basement wall. They served as a reminder of the darkness that had once consumed Witheridge and a warning of the darkness that could be summoned again. With this thought, he dedicated himself to safeguarding his town, studying the occult symbols, ensuring that no such menace would ever rise again. He realized his move from the city was not just to care for his ailing mother, but for something far greater, to become the silent guardian of Witheridge. And thus, in the quiet town of Witheridge, an ordinary man named Elijah Hawthorne became an unlikely hero, forever vigilant against the shadows of the past.